A knock at the door. 3 sharp raps. Mr. Pemberton. I set my coffee down before I even opened the door. Some habits from 35 years of contract law never leave you. The sound of an official knock is different from a neighbor's knock, and you learn to hear the difference in your sleep. The man on my porch wore a lanyard with the Ashcombe Grove HOA logo, holding a clipboard like it was a subpoena. I have an official notice to deliver in person, he said, already sliding a folded paper into my hand before I'd said a word. You have 10 days to remove all poultry from the premises. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and possible legal referral to the county. I unfolded the paper slowly. Read it once. Read the second paragraph again, because the first time through, I genuinely thought I'd misread the number $500 per week. I looked past his shoulder out toward the backyard, where 3 hens were scratching at the dirt in a coop I'd built with my own hands 8 months ago, in a garden bed I dug exactly 1 week before Eleanor died. She used to talk about that garden the way other people talk about vacations. They're saving up for someday when we retire, when things slow down. She never got the someday. I built it for her anyway 6 months too late and put chickens in it because it was the only version of her dream I still knew how to finish alone. Sir, the man said, do you understand the notice? I understand it perfectly, I said. I spent 35 years reading documents exactly like this one for a living. Which is precisely why I'd like to see the original bylaw this is based on, not a summary, the actual recorded language. He blinked clearly, not expecting the question. I'll have to check on that. You do that, I said, and closed the door gently, the notice still warm in my hand, the clock already running. I stood in the entryway for a moment after the door clicked shut, listening to his footsteps recede down the driveway, the folder of paper in my hand somehow heavier than its actual weight. 8 months. That's how long it had been since the funeral, since the house had gone from too full of Eleanor's voice to unbearably quiet in the space of a single hospital phone call. I remember standing in this same entryway the morning after, unable to decide whether to leave her reading glasses on the side table or put them away, settling in the end on leaving them exactly where she'd set them last. They're still there. I've stopped trying to explain that decision to anyone who asks, including myself. The chickens came 4 months later in March, on a morning I'd woken up and simply couldn't think of a single reason to get out of bed before 11. I remembered somewhere in that fog a conversation from years earlier, Eleanor standing at this same kitchen window, watching a neighbor's hens peck around a yard 3 doors down, saying almost wistfully, when we finally slow down, I want a few of those. Nothing fancy. Just enough to know something. Just enough to have somewhere to be every morning. We never got to slow down together. I built the coop anyway alone over 4 Saturdays, following instructions. I printed off a website with unsteady hands, and by the time the first hen laid an egg in that coop, I had somewhere to be every morning again, exactly the way she'd described it, except I was the only one there to see it. I called the association office within the hour. A woman named Cheryl answered, pleasant enough, told me the notice was issued under something called General Regulation 14, prohibiting livestock and poultry in residential zones. I asked her to email me the full text of Regulation 14 word for word as originally adopted. She put me on hold for 6 minutes, came back and told me the original adoption record wasn't currently available in digital format, but she could send me the current summary posted on the resident portal. A summary, not the document itself. In 35 years of reviewing contracts, I learned exactly one thing you can count on when somebody offers you a summary instead of the original text. It's because the original text says something they'd rather you not read closely. I'll need the original, I told her, not the summary, the recorded text with the adoption date and vote record. I can put in a request, she said in the tone of someone who has said that sentence many times before and watched it go nowhere every time. 10 days, that's what the notice said. 10 days to dismantle a coop I built with my own hands to give away 3 birds that had become, without my quite realizing it, the only reason I got out of bed some mornings before 9. I sat at the kitchen table that evening with the notice spread out in front of me, a legal pad beside it, and started doing what I do. Reading every word like it might be hiding something, because in my experience it usually is. The next morning, I walked to the mailbox and found Gordon Reyes standing at the end of my driveway, apparently waiting for me, a folder tucked under one arm. I want to be precise about how that moment felt, because precision was my entire profession for 35 years, and I don't intend to abandon it now just because the subject has gotten personal. Gordon Reyes is not on the surface an unpleasant man. He dresses well for a suburban HOA president, speaks in the calm, measured cadence of somebody who has sat through a great many contentious meetings and learned exactly how to lower his voice at the moment other people are raising theirs. I'd shaken his hand at exactly 3 prior community gatherings over the years, exchanged the kind of pleasantries neighbors exchange, and thought nothing more of him than I think of most people I encounter twice a year at a mailbox. He'd been HOA president for 9 years, unopposed in every election since his first term, a fact I only knew because Eleanor used to complain about it over dinner. Nobody ever runs against him. Arthur, it's not even a real vote anymore. I remember telling her at the time that uncontested elections and small associations weren't necessarily sinister, that sometimes people just genuinely don't want the job. I think about that conversation differently now. Mr. Pemberton, he said, extending a hand. I shook out of habit more than warmth. I wanted to speak with you personally. I understand your recent loss, and I want you to know the board isn't unsympathetic. But regulations exist for a reason. We can't make exceptions based on individual circumstances, however difficult they may be. I'm not asking for an exception, I said. I'm asking to see the regulation, the actual text, not a summary, not a paraphrase. The document as adopted with a date and a vote count. Something moved behind his eyes, quick, almost imperceptible, the kind of flicker you learn to catch after decades of sitting across negotiating tables from people who don't want to answer a direct question. That information is available through the office, he said. I'm not able to produce archival documents from a driveway conversation. Then I'll see you at the office, I said. He smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach anywhere near the eyes. I hope this doesn't need to become adversarial, Arthur. We're neighbors. We are, I agreed. I'd like to stay that way, which is why I'd like to see the document before anyone loses $300 a week over a misunderstanding. I didn't correct my number down to what the notice actually said. He just nodded, once told me to have a good day, and walked back toward his own house at the end of the cul-de-sac, the folder still tucked under his arm, never opened. Day 3. A second letter arrived, this one from a law office representing the association, informing me that continued non-compliance would result in the fine doubling to reflect willful obstruction, and that further legal action, including a potential lien against my property, remained on the table if the matter wasn't resolved within the original window. I read that letter twice, standing at my own mailbox in my robe, and felt something in my chest tighten that had nothing to do with money. Eleanor and I bought this house 22 years ago. I paid it off 11 years ago, throwing a small, quiet party for exactly the 2 of us, a bottle of wine we couldn't really afford at the time and drank anyway. Nobody threatens a lien on a paid-off house over 3 chickens without believing somewhere that the person on the other end will simply fold rather than fight. Later that same afternoon, a second visitor arrived. Not an HOA representative this time, but a neighbor 2 doors down, a man named Callahan. I'd exchanged maybe a dozen words with in 22 years, mostly about lawn equipment. He stood at the end of my driveway looking uncomfortable, glancing back toward his own house before he spoke. I heard about the notice, he said. I just wanted to say a few years back I got one too, about a small greenhouse I'd put up. Didn't fight it, just tore the thing down inside the week. Cost me about $400 in materials I never got back. He shifted his weight. Wasn't sure it was worth mentioning until I heard you were actually pushing back on this one. Most people just tear it down and move on. Did they ever show you the regulation itself, I asked. The actual text, not a summary. I thought about it, and something in his expression shifted, slow and uncertain, like a memory being examined for the first time in years. No, he said finally. I don't think they did. I don't think I ever asked. I am not in the habit of folding. It's possibly the single least useful trait for a man trying to enjoy a peaceful retirement, and possibly the most useful trait for a man who's about to need it. I spent that evening doing something I hadn't done in years, pulling my old closing files out of a storage box in the garage. Not because any of them were relevant, but because the physical act of sorting through contract language, watching my own younger handwriting in the margins of decades-old agreements, seemed to settle something in me that afternoon walks around the block hadn't managed to touch. Somewhere around midnight, still sitting on the garage floor, surrounded by manila folders, I found the thing I was actually looking for, without realizing I'd been looking for it, my own copy of the original disclosure packet from when Eleanor and I bought this house 22 years earlier. Buried in page 14 in language so standard, I'd apparently skimmed straight past it at the closing table, was a reference to governing documents recorded with the county available upon request, a sentence I'd never once in 22 years thought to act on. I made a note on the legal pad. County Archive, tomorrow. Day 5. I drove to the County Archive building downtown, the kind of place that still smells like paper dust and fluorescent lighting, and requested any available historical records for the Ashcombe Grove subdivision. The clerk, a young man who looked mildly surprised. Anyone still requested physical archives disappeared for 20 minutes and came back with a thin folder that felt entirely too light to contain what I was hoping for. Inside was a partial copy of something called the Ashcombe Grove Founding Covenant, dated 1971. The ink faded, several pages missing entirely, the kind of document that had clearly been photocopied from a photocopy over the decades until it was barely legible in places. But one section, Section 14, Clause C, was still readable enough to make my pulse do something it hadn't done in months. Original parcel holders, it read, shall retain permanent right to maintain small-scale domestic poultry for personal use, consistent with the founding community's semi-agrarian character, notwithstanding any subsequent general regulation to the contrary. I read it 4 times. Then I pulled the property records for my own lot, cross-referenced the parcel number against the original 1971 subdivision plat, included further back in the same folder, and found my address plain as anything listed among the original 40 parcels the covenant named directly. The current regulation banning poultry, the one printed on the notice sitting on my kitchen table, didn't override this. It couldn't. Not legally. Not if this covenant was still valid, which meant somebody at some point had either forgotten this clause existed or had made very sure that nobody remembered it. Day 6. I called Marjorie Sable, 81 years old, the longest continuous resident of Ashcombe Grove, a woman Eleanor used to bring soup to whenever she was under the weather. Marjorie had served as the association's volunteer records secretary for nearly 2 decades before handing the job off years ago. When I mentioned Section 14, Clause C, her voice on the phone went very quiet. I remember that clause, she said slowly. I typed half the original bylaws myself, Arthur, back when we still used a typewriter for board minutes. There was a whole philosophy behind this place. When it started, families wanted a little bit of country life without leaving the county. Small gardens, a few chickens, that sort of thing. It was part of what made people want to move here in the first place. Do you know what happened to it? I asked. It's not in the current digital bylaws, not anywhere on the resident portal. A long pause. About 6 years ago, she said, Gordon proposed what he called a full modernization of the governing documents. Said the old covenant language was outdated, redundant, needed cleaning up for legal clarity. He handled the whole digitization project himself. I offered to help. He said it wasn't necessary, that a paralegal friend of his was handling it professionally. Her voice tightened. I should have insisted. I didn't think to ask what got left out. I asked her if she still had any of her own personal copies from her years as records secretary, the kind of informal backup a careful volunteer sometimes keeps without ever mentioning it to anyone, just in case. There was a pause on the line long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. I have 3 banker's boxes in my attic, she finally said. Haven't opened them since the day I handed the job off. My knees aren't what they used to be for attic stairs, Arthur, but if you're willing to do the climbing, I'll tell you exactly where to look. I drove over within the hour. Marjorie's attic was exactly what you'd expect from a woman who'd spent 2 decades as an unpaid records secretary out of sheer civic devotion. Labeled boxes. Careful handwriting on masking tape. A level of organization that put my own garage files to shame. In the second box I opened, beneath a stack of old newsletters from the early 80s, I found a slightly more complete photocopy of the original covenant than the one from the county archive. This one including 2 pages. The county's copy had been missing entirely. Pages that laid out in plain language exactly which 40 parcels had been designated as original under the founding agreement, along with a hand-drawn plat map matching addresses to lot numbers in Marjorie's own careful pen. My address was there, 3rd from the top in a column of 40. I sat on the floor of Marjorie's attic for a long while. After that, longer than the discovery itself probably warranted the hand-drawn plat map resting across my knees. There's a particular feeling that comes with finding your own name, or in this case, your own address. Inside a document you never knew existed, a feeling somewhere between vindication and vertigo. For 22 years, I'd assumed the rules governing this neighborhood were whatever the current HOA said they were, the way most people assume it, the way I'd probably have kept assuming it if a man hadn't knocked on my door with a clipboard and a 10-day deadline. It occurred to me sitting there that this was likely true for every one of the other 39 original parcels too. 39 other households who had no idea a piece of their own property rights had been quietly filed out of existence. I photographed every page of Marjorie's boxes that afternoon, cross-referenced each one against the county's thinner copy, and built by evening a single composite document more complete than either archive held on its own. Diane, when I sent it to her that night, called back within 20 minutes, her voice carrying an energy I hadn't heard in her yet. "Arthur, this isn't just a technicality," she said. "If the covenant was never lawfully amended, then every fine issued under the current poultry regulation going back years is potentially void. Not just yours, every single one." I hadn't thought that far ahead. I'd been focused entirely on 3 hens in 10 days. It hadn't occurred to me until she said it plainly that the fight in front of me might end up being considerably larger than the fight I thought I was having. Day 7. I stepped into my backyard that morning to find one of my 3 hens dead in the coop, no visible wound, no obvious cause, lying on her side in the dirt, the way nothing alive ever lies. I stood there for a long moment before I felt anything at all, and what I felt when it finally arrived wasn't grief exactly. It was something colder, something closer to recognition. I have no proof anyone did anything to that bird. I want to be honest about that because I built a career on the difference between suspicion and evidence, and I'm not going to abandon that distinction now just because it would feel satisfying to abandon it. But I buried her at the edge of Eleanor's garden that afternoon, and I noted in the same legal pad where I'd been tracking every date and every letter the exact time I found her. 10 days doesn't feel like very much time when half of it has already gone toward finding out that the people threatening you may have quietly erased your rights on purpose. I called Diane Whitcomb that evening. Diane moved into the neighborhood 8 months earlier, fresh out of a litigation associate position at a firm downtown, the kind of young lawyer who still gets a small thrill out of a well-drafted motion. She'd introduced herself to me at Eleanor's memorial gathering, mentioned she admired the framed contract on my study wall, the first major merger agreement I'd ever closed 30 years ago. A strange thing to keep on display, but Eleanor always said it was the only piece of art in the house that actually meant something to me. "I found the original covenant language," I told her over the phone. "Section 14. It's been stripped out of the current bylaws, and I have reason to believe it happened without proper process." "Send me everything you have," she said, no hesitation at all. "And Arthur, don't sign anything, don't pay anything, don't agree to remove those chickens until we've mapped out exactly what leverage you actually have. You may have a lot more than you think." Day 8. Diane pulled the digitized bylaws currently posted on the resident portal and compared the adoption history against the meeting minutes the association was legally required to keep on file. What she found took her less than a day to uncover, and it made the coldness in my chest sharpen into something closer to focus. The vote to adopt the modernized General Regulation 14, the one banning poultry outright, the one currently sitting as a threat on my kitchen table, had taken place at a meeting attended by exactly 6 residents. The association's own bylaws required a minimum quorum of 30% of homeowners present or represented by proxy for any amendment to governing covenants. Ashcombe Grove had roughly 210 households at the time. 6 people did not come remotely close to 30% of anything. Gordon Reyes had proposed the amendment. Gordon Reyes had chaired the meeting. Gordon Reyes had certified the minutes as accurate and complete. There was one more detail Diane found that night, one she almost mentioned in passing before catching herself and reading it twice to make sure she had it right. The paralegal Gordon claimed had reviewed the modernized bylaws for legal soundness, the one Patricia would later say she never actually saw any documentation for shared a last name with Gordon's wife. Whether that was coincidence or something else, Diane wouldn't speculate out loud, and neither would I. Some things you let the room draw its own conclusions about once the room has all the same facts you do. Danina, an unmarked call came in on my cell phone a little after 10 at night, a voice I couldn't quite place, low, unhurried. "You should think carefully about how far you want to take this, Arthur. Some things are better left where they've been sitting for years. Digging them up doesn't always end the way you expect." I didn't respond right away. I've sat across from enough people trying to intimidate their way out of a bad contract to know that silence held long enough usually says more than any comeback I could offer. Finally, I said, "I'll take that under advisement," and hung up. The next morning, a real estate sign appeared driven into my front lawn. One I hadn't ordered and hadn't authorized, printed with a generic for sale banner and a phone number that, when I called it later that day, connected to a disconnected line. I pulled the sign out of the ground myself, my hand steadier than I expected, and leaned it against the garage, another item for the legal pad. 10 days. The deadline arrived that afternoon, and with it a final notice. The fine now doubled to $1,000 per week, effective immediately, along with formal notification that the matter would be referred to the association's attorney for lien proceedings if the birds weren't removed by end of day. I did not remove the birds. Instead, that evening, Diane and I sat at my kitchen table with the bylaws spread open beside the original covenant excerpt, and she pointed to a clause I'd read past twice without registering its full weight, a provision allowing any group of residents representing at least 15% of households to petition for a special membership meeting to reconsider any board resolution provided proper notice and signatures were gathered. 15% of 210 households came to roughly 32 signatures, not an impossible number. Not given what I now knew about how thin the board's own legitimacy actually was an unreasonable one either. "We have 48 hours before the lien filing window opens," Diane said. "If we're doing this, we do it now." Marjorie was already reaching for her coat before either of us finished the sentence. We split the neighborhood into thirds. Marjorie took the streets she'd known longest, the original families who remembered her from decades of block parties and casserole deliveries. Diane took the newer arrivals, people more comfortable with a clipboard and a clear legal explanation than with neighborhood history. I took the middle third myself, walking the same sidewalks. Eleanor and I used to walk most evenings after dinner, knocking on doors I hadn't knocked on in years. The response surprised me. Not everyone signed immediately. A few were nervous about crossing Gordon. A few didn't want to get involved in what they assumed was a personal grudge over some chickens. But enough people, once they heard the actual covenant language read aloud, once they understood their own original parcels, might carry the same forgotten right. Mine did, signed without much hesitation at all. One older man, a retired postal worker named Dell, who'd lived in Ashcombe Grove even longer than I, had laughed out loud when I read him Section 14, Clause C. "I used to keep bees back here in the 80s, he said. "Somebody on the board back then told me it wasn't allowed anymore. I never thought to ask them to show me where it said that. Just took their word for it and gave the hives away." He signed the petition, then signed it a second time on a spare line, just in case. He said they tried to claim the first signature didn't count. Not every door opened easily. One woman, younger, newer to the neighborhood, told me flatly through a cracked door chain that she didn't want to get on Gordon's bad side over somebody else's chickens, and closed the door before I could explain that her own lot number appeared on the same original parcel list mine did. Another man simply didn't answer, though I could hear a television playing inside and see a shadow moving past the front window. I didn't push either of them. There's a difference between building a case and building resentment, and I'd spent enough of my career learning which fights were worth the doorstep and which ones weren't. By 11 o'clock that night, we had 38 signatures, 6 more than we needed. We filed the petition electronically at 11:47 p.m., 4 hours and 13 minutes before the original lien filing window would have opened. Diane, watching the confirmation screen load, let out a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding either. "Now we wait for the meeting," she said. "And Arthur, when this gets scheduled, you should be the one who stands up first. It should be you." The special meeting was set for the following Thursday, 7 days out, held at the community clubhouse where I'd sat through exactly 2 prior HOA meetings in 22 years of living in this neighborhood, both times half asleep by the second agenda item. This time I read every page of the bylaws twice more before Thursday arrived, memorized every procedural objection Gordon might attempt to raise, and rehearsed quietly in the mirror of a bathroom I hadn't used for anything but shaving in longer than I could remember exactly how I intended to read Section 14 aloud. The clubhouse was full by 645 folding chairs, pulled from a storage closet to handle an overflow nobody had planned for. Word travels fast in a neighborhood once people believe there might be something worth showing up for. Gordon stood at the front, near a small podium, flanked by 2 board members I recognized from prior newsletters, his expression composed in the particular way of a man who has never once lost a vote and doesn't believe tonight will be any different. "Before we begin," he said, tapping the microphone once, "I want to note for the record that this special meeting notice may not have met the required 14-day window under our current bylaws, and I'd ask the board to consider tabling any vote until proper notice can be verified." I stood before he'd fully finished the sentence. "The 14-day requirement applies to board-initiated amendments," I said, holding up the printed bylaws, the relevant section already flagged with a yellow tab I'd placed there 2 nights earlier. "Petitions initiated by resident signature under Article 9, Section 2 require only 72 hours notice once the signature threshold is met and verified. We met that threshold Sunday night. Notice went out Monday morning. That's within the window you yourself certified when you signed off on this exact bylaw revision 3 years ago, Mr. Reyes. A ripple moved through the room, the specific kind of ripple that happens when a room full of people realizes the person at the podium has just been caught contradicting his own paperwork. Gordon's jaw tightened, but he gestured for me to continue the closest thing to a concession he was willing to offer in front of that many neighbors. Before I reached the front one of the two attorneys, the association had retained the same firm that had sent the letters threatening a lien stood from a seat near the side aisle and raised a hand. For the record, he said, the association reserves the right to challenge the authenticity of any document presented tonight that hasn't been formally certified by the county recorder's office. I stopped, turned toward him, and reached into my folder for the second copy I'd made that morning, precisely because I'd anticipated this exact objection 2 nights earlier while rehearsing in the bathroom mirror. This copy, I said, holding up a page stamped in blue ink, was certified by the county recorder's office yesterday afternoon, file reference attached. I'd be glad to pass it to your table for review before I continue if that would satisfy the objection. The attorney took this page, studied it for a moment longer than necessary, and sat back down without another word. Gordon didn't look at him. I noticed that particularly the exact moment a man stops trusting the people he hired to protect him. I walked to the front, unfolded the covenant excerpt, and began to read slowly, word for word, letting the room hear exactly what the founding document had promised. Original parcel holders shall retain permanent right to maintain small-scale domestic poultry for personal use, consistent with the founding community's semi-agrarian character, notwithstanding any subsequent general regulation to the contrary. I looked up. This is Section 14, Clause C of the Ashcombe Grove Founding Covenant, adopted in 1971. It has never been formally repealed. What has happened instead is that it was quietly omitted during a digitization project overseen personally by Mr. Reyes 6 years ago and replaced with a general regulation that directly contradicts it, adopted according to the association's own meeting minutes at a session attended by 6 residents. Our bylaws require a 30% quorum for any covenant amendment. 6 residents is not 30% of this room, let alone this neighborhood. Dell, the retired postal worker, stood up near the back. I kept bees on my property in the 80s, he said. Somebody told me it wasn't allowed anymore. Nobody ever showed me this. A woman I recognized vaguely from the newer side of the neighborhood stood next. My lot's one of the original 40 listed in that plat map. I had no idea any of this existed. 2 more residents stood, then a third, each adding some small fragment. A garden bed moved, a beehive given away, a rooster surrendered years ago. After a neighbor complained, all of it, built on a regulation that, as far as the room could now see, plainly had never been legitimately adopted in the first place. I let each of them finish before continuing, because there's a particular kind of momentum a room builds on its own. Once people start recognizing their own story in somebody else's, and interrupting it too early only slows it back down. Diane, standing near the front with a legal pad of her own, was quietly noting names as people spoke in case any of it needed to be entered into a formal record later. Marjorie sat in the front row with the covenant excerpt in her lap, mouthing the words along with me. The second time I read Section 14 aloud for a resident who'd arrived a few minutes late and asked to hear it again. One of the 2 board members flanking Gordon, a woman named Patricia, who'd served alongside him for nearly 4 years, cleared her throat and stepped slightly away from the podium. I need to say something, she said, voice unsteady but audible. I was at that meeting 6 years ago. There were 6 of us in the room. Gordon told us the covenant language was outdated and redundant, that a lawyer friend had already reviewed the changes for legal soundness. We voted yes because we trusted him. I never saw a legal review. I don't think one exists. The second board member, a quieter man named Frank, nodded slowly beside her, saying nothing, which in that room at that moment said quite a lot on its own. Somewhere near the middle of the room, a man I didn't recognize stood holding a folded piece of paper of his own. He introduced himself as a resident from the far side of the neighborhood, one of the original 40 parcel holders, and said he'd brought his father's old beekeeping equipment records. His father, now deceased, had kept hives on the property for nearly 15 years before some letter showed up in the mid-2000s telling him to stop. He'd never questioned it. He'd simply assumed the rules had changed the way people assume rules change all the time, without ever bothering to ask who changed them or when. He set the folded paper down on the table beside my own documents, a small, quiet gesture that felt somehow heavier than anything spoken aloud that night. Gordon's composure finally slipped just slightly at the edges. I was modernizing an outdated governing structure, he said, his voice climbing half a register. Some of these old provisions simply don't reflect how this community functions today. I don't see why. He stopped himself half a sentence too late. The room had already heard it, an open admission that he'd known the original clause existed and had chosen deliberately to remove it rather than bring it back to a properly quorumed vote. You knew, I said quietly enough that the room had to lean in to hear it, which made it land harder than if I'd shouted. You knew this clause existed. You knew it protected specific parcels, including mine. And instead of putting it to an honest vote, you buried it in a digitization project nobody was allowed to review. Diane, standing beside Marjorie near the front row, raised her hand for procedural recognition. Under Article 9, Section 4, she said, residents present at a properly noticed special meeting may call for an immediate vote to restore any improperly amended covenant provision and separately to remove any board member found to have knowingly circumvented quorum requirements in the adoption of that amendment. The vote, when it came, wasn't close. Section 14, Clause C restored in full the original poultry rights reinstated for all 40 original parcels. And in the same motion by a margin that left no ambiguity at all, the entire sitting board, Gordon Reyes included, removed from office, effective immediately pending a new election, to be held within 30 days under direct supervision of a resident oversight committee. Someone near the back called out, half joking, half not asking whether the vote also retroactively voided every fine ever issued under the old regulation. Marjorie, still holding the gavel she'd been handed to run the procedural vote, looked toward Diane, who simply nodded once, and Marjorie announced without hesitation that any resident who believed they'd been wrongly fined under the now void regulation should submit a written request to the new Oversight Committee for review. A second small ripple moved through the room, at that less dramatic than the one before, but no less real, the sound of people quietly doing math about garden beds, moved hives, given away roosters, surrendered all of it, years too late to undo, but perhaps not too late to be acknowledged. Gordon didn't argue the outcome. He didn't have much left to argue with by that point. He gathered his folder, the same one he'd carried to my driveway 10 days earlier, still as far as I ever learned, never actually opened in front of me, and walked out through the side door without another word to anyone in that room. Nobody clapped. I remember that specifically because some part of me expected applause the way you might expect it after any clean, decisive ending. Instead, the room simply exhaled all at once, the particular collective sound of several dozen people realizing a tension they'd been carrying without quite naming it had finally actually lifted. Dell came up afterward and shook my hand for slightly longer than a handshake usually lasts. Marjorie hugged me, which she had never once done in 22 years of friendship with Eleanor and me, and told me quietly that Eleanor would have been the first person clapping if she'd been there, and probably the loudest. The days after moved quietly, in the particular way things move once a fight is actually over, rather than simply won. The association's insurance carrier flagged the improperly adopted regulation as a governance liability, and any outstanding fines tied to poultry violations across the neighborhood, mine included, along with at least 4 other households who'd quietly given up birds or gardens over the years, rather than challenge a rule none of them had ever seen in writing, were formally voided. Several residents asked whether I intended to run for the vacant board president seat myself. I understood the impulse behind the question. I declined it just as quickly. I spent 35 years reading contracts so other people wouldn't get taken advantage of by fine print. I told the temporary meeting Marjorie convened the following week, I don't especially want to spend what's left of my retirement chasing down other people's fine print for a living. But I'd support Marjorie stepping in as interim president. She's the only person in this neighborhood who actually remembers what this place was supposed to be when it started. Marjorie accepted on one condition. She insisted on herself a standing transparency requirement that any future amendment to the founding covenant be published in full with complete meeting minutes and signature counts available to any resident who asked permanently, with no summaries standing in for the original text ever again. Patricia and Frank, the 2 board members who'd spoken up that night, both joined the new Oversight Committee, less out of obligation than what struck me as genuine relief at finally being allowed to do the job honestly. I never did learn who made that phone call or who drove that fake real estate sign into my lawn. I've made my peace with that particular loose thread. Some things in the end don't need a name attached to them to be understood for exactly what they were. An attempt to make an old man fold quietly rather than read the paperwork all the way through. Gordon moved out of the neighborhood entirely about 2 months later. I heard it secondhand the way you hear most things in a place like this from Marjorie, who heard it from someone on the new Oversight Committee who'd noticed the moving truck. I felt less satisfaction at the news than I expected to. Mostly I felt a kind of tiredness. The specific fatigue that settles in after a long negotiation finally closes. Win or lose when there's nothing left to do but file the paperwork away and go back to an ordinary life you'd almost forgotten you were allowed to have. Diane started her own small practice a few months after that. Something focused specifically on homeowner association disputes, a niche she told me she'd never once considered before this. I spent 2 years doing corporate litigation nobody outside a boardroom would ever care about, she said the last time she stopped by with a bottle of wine to celebrate the practice's first real client. Turns out I'd rather spend my career reading fine print for people like Dell. Somebody has to. Marjorie, for her part, has taken to opening every board meeting under her interim presidency by reading a different clause of the original 1971 covenant, aloud one section at a time, until the whole document has been read into the record publicly for the first time in decades. She told me she intends to keep doing it until every resident in Ashcombe Grove has heard at least once exactly what this neighborhood originally promised the people who moved here. This morning I walked out to the coop before the coffee had even finished brewing. 5 hens now, not 3, 2 of them, gifts from neighbors who heard the story and wanted in their own small way to be part of restoring something that had quietly gone missing from this place. I stood at the edge of the garden. I dug for Eleanor a week before she died, watching them scratch at the dirt, in exactly the way she used to describe when she talked about someday, and I thought not for the first time that 35 years of reading fine print for other people's benefit had finally once been put to use for something entirely my own. I spent my whole career reading the smallest print in a document, the parts most people skip past on their way to the signature line, because that's usually where somebody's trying to take something from you without your noticing. I never once expected I'd have to use that same skill to protect 3 chickens and a promise I made too late to a woman who never got to see it kept. But I did. And I do it again every single time, because some promises don't stop mattering just because the person you made them to isn't here anymore to see you keep them. So here's what I'd ask you if you're listening to this with your own quiet stack of paperwork sitting somewhere in a drawer you haven't opened in years. If you found out tomorrow that a right you always assumed was gone had actually just been buried deliberately by someone counting on you, never checking, would you have the patience to read every page until you found it? Or would you let it stay buried the way so many people in my own neighborhood did for years simply because nobody ever told them to look? Tell me in the comments. I'll be out back with the chickens and I read everyone. This is Arthur Pemberton, signing off from a garden that finally belongs to the woman who dreamed it up in the first place. Read the fine print. Always read the fine print. It's usually where the truth was hiding the whole time.